Hi everyone, welcome to the third and final week of the presentation models module. This week we'll be covering presentation and finishing. Two very important considerations, which is to get the most out of your model and how your model can be communicated effectively within a presentation setting, whether that's digital as a remote environment or a physical model. So we'll just begin by recapping the module requirements, which I'm sure most of you have seen by now. There are two models, a minimum of two models that are required, and we kept these scales quite open to suit your studios. Each studio is going to have a slightly different scale that's suited to communicating your proposals well. We have had a few students contacting us with concerns about which scales are appropriate for their designs. We're happy to talk through that with you, but it's also worth discussing with your tutors what is going to be the most effective way to communicate what they're looking for. You might find that your site project model could be 1 to 5,000, or it could be 1 to 200 for your studio brief. And again, with the detail model, you might find that it's interesting to do something even larger than 1 to 5 or something slightly smaller. But we really want you to consider how these two models are going to work together to communicate your proposal at different scales. So the ideal situation is where you have a model which captures your proposal or a proportion of your proposal, and then your detail model, which in this image here captures really well the type of space and the quality of materials and the assembly of the building. And so with simply a model like this and maybe an overall model of the building cited within a context, they work really well together to communicate an overall proposal. And so you can start to consider how these are going to be communicated and submitted. We are going to be requiring a digital submission, which could be as simple as photographs of your model, but you can also be a little bit more innovative in how you want to present them to us. I'll provide some examples in the following slides about GIFs, and the previous lesson provided some videos. So just start to think about how you can actually really capture these models effectively. So we just wanted to, I guess, express the importance of presentations in remote environments, and especially with the presentation models that you'll be submitting. Consider them as a tool to really communicate your proposal. So they're not just standalone elements now that tutors will be able to walk around and pick up and investigate themselves. So you need to think about how this becomes more than just a static object. So you'll see the image on the left. It's quite beautiful. This is an extreme example. We would definitely expect more from you in terms of the scope of the model, but you can see how this presentation communicates very clearly a certain atmosphere, a certain quirkiness, and a certain homeliness and a domestic level of the design. And it's basically, the model is only a hearth or a very simple slender core, and the presentation then starts to add and augment this presentation in the model in a very quirky way. And so we'd like you to consider at this stage all of the skills that you've picked up over your degree, whether they're digital or analog skills, and start to think how they can come together to really augment your model presentation. So it can be, you can just heavily rely on your physical modeling skills, but start to think of how you can actually blend these two modes to get the most out of it and make the most evocative presentation possible. And so the final point with that is it's no longer just a model, it is a presentation. Because you aren't leaving the model on a table and letting someone spin around it and look at it, you now have to consider how is the model going to be presented to the audience. So you get to capture the images, you get to choose the angles. This next slide is a perfect example of what we're trying to express to you guys. Only show what you want and hide everything else. So This image, I'm sure it needs no explanation whatsoever. What we're trying to express with this is you get to choose and curate the views that you want us to see. It's not a typical physical model, and that's the benefit of this digital submission. You are able to use your expertise in capturing images, in augmenting images, and only being selective in what you need to model. So you only have 4 weeks to go. So think of how much time you're going to be able to spend on these models, and where should your time be best placed to model these details and model your proposal effectively. We do have a tendency to want to model every single detail in our models. It's not necessarily the best approach now. You can think about where you could be more selective and more detailed, and then areas where you can keep it quite pared back because you know that they won't be presented. That is one of the benefits of this mode, is that normally a tutor will be able to spin around and find any defects and flaws and imperfections. So you get to choose what you show us. And finally, any imperfections that you do have, you can touch them up in Photoshop. So you have the benefit of capturing exactly what you want to show, and any blemishes or anything that you don't get around to, or anything that really needs that final bit of detail, you can manipulate that yourself. We could have selected a whole range of models and projects to explain what we're trying to talk about, but I thought this was a really nice example in terms of how this model has been used to be a proof of concept. So for anyone that's familiar with this building, this is the RMIT Design Hub designed by Sean Godsell in 2012. It's an absolutely stunning building with some beautiful details. There's, I think, over 9,000 frosted glass discs, and a certain proportion of those discs are operable, and they actually pull in air into the inner spaces. And so the model in the center is probably a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 20 scale model, and that starts to express some of the junctions and the layering of the facade and the internal spaces and their relationship. But there's still quite a lot of detail missing in terms of the tectonics and the assembly of these materials, and you still don't get a full sense of either the frosted glass or these metal rings. If you have a look on the far right, you'll see a 1-to-1 model, which was actually used in a wind tunnel test, and this is the best example of a proof of concept. So they actually they built the assemblies and the mechanisms that allowed the flaps to open, and they tested it at high wind conditions to see, number one, if the panels were going to hold, and number two, if they were able to pull the air into the spaces adequately. So you can start to think about how these models are really going to help prove your concept. So they shouldn't just be something that's aesthetic. Normally when you're working in drawings and renderings, it's very easy to design something that may not be physically feasible. And so with models, there's nowhere to hide in terms of how things are assembled, especially the detail model, which is what we're really trying to talk about, is how can this detail model express the tectonics of your building. And some of these detail models are absolutely stunning, and they take a little bit of time, and you can start to really express the materiality and the operability of those models. We'll just quickly touch on modeling on a budget. We've had a few students, again, that have expressed a little bit of concern about how they are expected to model with limited budgets. There are a few slides on the online lesson which will address this in greater detail, but I just wanted to provide a few examples here of an approach that I find really interesting, where you can actually do 90% of the model with quite basic materials. So it could be bass, balsa, or plywood. In some of these examples, they're laser cut, although they could be hand cut with a simple knife as well. And what you're seeing in these images isn't these cheap materials for most of the part. Your eye is drawn to these interesting material qualities, And so it could be a perforated material, it could be a mesh, it could be a thin sheet of metal which is easy to cut with tin snips or scissors or a scoring of the knife. And so use these beautiful materials selectively. So you don't need to splash out and spend thousands of dollars on really nice materials. You can buy a quite an affordable brass, for example, in the right image, and that will cost you maybe $5, and that can really draw the eye and start to establish a sense of hierarchy in terms of what's the most important elements of your model that you're trying to draw your audience's attention to. So use these materials selectively and use them wisely to express key moments of your architectural qualities. It's not necessary to absolutely deck out your whole model with expensive materials. And that leads us to our final point, which is that we believe that high quality materials don't automatically equal high quality model. So don't feel like you need to spend money on expensive materials at all. There's a few examples in the online lesson of how you can be selective and strategic on how to build final presentation models with materials at hand. With that, we're encouraging all students to augment their presentations, and that's not just with the presentation models, that's also for your final presentations. You should start to think about exploring innovative ways to communicate your proposals to keep your audience engaged, whether that's through screen or as a physical presentation. Use animation, use graphics, use diagrams, and start to explore what these buildings are like in context, in environmental conditions, and how operability works. And you can start to consider some of these skills that we provided to you in digital fabrication. So 3D scanning, for example, you're able to 3D scan some details of your models. You could then present that in your final presentation as potentially an AR or augmented reality model, which you could then send to your tutors. So even if you aren't able to be in the same room as your tutors or your guest crits, they're actually able to spin around the model, have a look through your design as if they were there. So it's adding another level of interactiveness to your presentations, which typically isn't afforded in a digital remote environment. We won't be providing any specific examples on how to create these innovative presentation environments, I guess. That's something for you guys to pursue. We're happy to discuss if you feel like you want to email us or get onto a Zoom call with us. We're happy to chat through some ideas, but this is your opportunity to be very bespoke in how you want to communicate your designs. And finally, feedback on presenting. So we'll be offering ourselves through email and through Zoom in the coming weeks to not only hone your model and your model making skills. If you have any other general queries about verbal presentation, your graphical style, your layouts on a panel, your layouts in a presentation slide, how you want to get the most out of your model animations, we're happy to provide any general feedback on any of that. And we really want you guys to get the most out of your presentations. You've been looking at your material for close to 6-7 months now, so we're happy to actually dissect that, look at each of these components of your presentation and say what works, what doesn't work, how can you communicate this more effectively given that you only have a certain amount of time to present your narrative, all the way from your initial research question through to your final design resolution. And I'll just end on this final image, which I've always been very fond of, which is a levitating, exploding model of Frank Lloyd Wright's Herbert Jacobs House #1. This model was designed by Situ Studio, and to me it's always been one of the most stunning ways to approach the presentation of a model. So all of the components of the model are there, but they've taken an extra step further that you would only typically be able to achieve through graphics, where they've actually started to pull the model apart and suspend it in string. and it's a really impressive way to communicate it. And this was in a gallery, so the audience were able to walk around and actually investigate the core, the facade, the structural elements, the roof planes, and it's something that you guys should really be considering now, not necessarily in this exact example where they've suspended it in strings, but think of how you can actually get the most out of your static physical model to bring it into an interactive digital environment, potentially to help us and help your crits and your tutors to really understand your final design resolution. We'll be in touch, and good luck for the last couple of weeks.